Hi team, welcome to Flip Video 6.3. We're going to get started and we're going to be looking at the British and French colonialism in North America. Now let's be clear, North America extends all the way down to Panama, so all those Central American countries we studied so far, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, so on and so forth, those are all included in North America, as is the Caribbean. So we're going to be turning our attention to the areas that are modern-day Mexico, the United States, and Canada. In general, these areas were considered to be less desirable by the colonizing powers simply because they didn't have the gold, nor did they have the environment for growing sugar that the Central and South American regions did. So West Indies, the Caribbean region, was significantly more profitable for the colonizing powers. There was in general also a much smaller population in North America. Now let's take a look specifically at the role of the French. The French began their colonization efforts in Canada, and they began, and you can see here, this is considered New France, quote unquote. The efforts of Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, the French got access here to what's known as the Northwest Passage, and so they've got a very thriving fur trade that occurs here in the Ohio River Valley, and as well as some small scale manufacturing, a few other things I'll get into. But the French didn't have a very permanent influence in this region because by about the 1760s, most of this territory had been lost to the British. The French and Indian War, for example, and then ultimately a man named Napoleon actually sells what would soon become the United, or at the time was the United States, in this territory known as the Louisiana Purchase. But you can see here that the French still had a sizable presence in the early 1600s. And that culture of the French still remains in areas down here in Louisiana and way up in Quebec and Canada, where French is still spoken. The Cajun language and the Cajun ethnicity, I should say, the Cajun culture in Louisiana still has strong influence of the French original colonization. You can also see here, too, some of the French colonies in the West Indies. So Saint Domingue, which is modern day Haiti, Guadeloupe, you can see some of the, these are regions that still are influenced by the French in their language. British North America. Now the British had a very different policy in general towards all of their colonies, because I'm going to be speaking about different regions of the colonies. In fact, actually, let's do that first. The colonies, beginning first, there's three regions that we were known as the 13 colonies, and to combine, they were the northern colonies, also known as New England, middle colonies, and the southern colonies that you can see listed here. And despite the fact that ultimately this was the foundation for the United States, these regions were very, very different and really not united with one another in any notable form until the mid 1700s. So, in general, one of the things that was, however, a unifying force for these colonies is the way the British treated these colonies politically. These colonies, unlike the viceroys, for example, in Spain, the colonies were founded on a policy known as salutary neglect. And here, um, unlike those viceroys, the monarchs do not have tremendous direct control within the colonies. In fact, salutary neglect means beneficial neglect. And this was a term that was used to describe the political policy that the British had towards the colonies up until 1763. And this policy essentially was that so long as the colonies provide economic benefits to Britain, the colonies were largely left alone. So there was this is kind of a goofy meme to depict this, but the idea here is just that as long as the colonies were benefiting, you're getting the mother country benefits, the political organization and the maintenance of the colonies was really left up until the individual groups themselves. That, of course, is going to lay the foundation for what we know as the American Revolution. Let's start with the northern colonies. The northern colonies were founded for religious purposes. So we're talking specifically the areas, again, northern colonies of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They were founded based upon a disagreement within the Anglican Church, and that's that same Anglican Church that this guy, Henry VIII, founded back in England. Those groups who were unhappy with the church were known as Puritans. They wanted to purify the church and get it back to its original intentions. There was a group, there were some Puritans who stayed within England, and then many continued to migrate to North America. But another group, more very vocal group known as the Pilgrims, wanted to separate from the church itself. And those Pilgrims are the ones who actually set sail, for what a story you may have heard before, on a ship called the Mayflower. And they set sail originally actually for Virginia, but they got off course and they settled in what's known as Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they came aboard at a place known as Plymouth Rock. So all things that may sound familiar to you if you've studied some American history before. So that's our Northern Colonies foundation. Politically, they were organized in a way that, just in a very democratic fashion. Their participation in the political system was really tied to your religion, but decisions were to be made by the majority, which is very different than some of the other ones, the other colonies we'll see. Economically, they're based upon fur trading, fishing, shipbuilding, long distance trade, manufacturing, small scale farming. Northern colonies had poor soil, so they really did not have the large scale agriculture that you found in the southern colonies. Now, that, of course, is going to be significant when we start to talk about the development of these economies, then would be significantly different in terms of their use of forced labor. Socially, the northern colonies were really based upon the church and community life. Makes sense. That's why they left England to begin with. And there's a famous phrase that comes from a later Puritan settler known as John Winthrop, who founds Rhode Island, saying that he was looking to create a quote city upon a hill. So imagine this city physically on top of a hill, a model of Christian living. So really strong influence of religion there in the northern colonies. The middle colonies are a blend between the two here, between the northern and the southern colonies. Politically, they were very democratic. All free men here, do note that free men, all free men in the colonies could vote, not just the land holding men, which was the case in the northern colonies. Economically, this is a very economically diverse region, so we had some of that commercial farming, some of the small scale merchants and trade. Socially, very diverse. There's various religious presence here, so there was present here. So there wasn't just one guiding force here of the Puritans or the Catholics. William Penn founded Pennsylvania. That's for whom Pennsylvania is named as a safe haven for religious dissidents. So anyone who was in opposition to, or anyone who was seeking religious freedom, was welcomed into Pennsylvania. Maryland passed was something known as the Act of Toleration that ensured protection specifically for Catholics, but that religious toleration didn't actually apply to people of other faiths. But what we see here is just a very already you can see the groundwork here being laid for differences within these colonies. Now that, of course, is going to become significant when we fast forward about 100 years here, and the United States or the 13 colony. Then the United States starts to engage in the Civil War. So here you see the economic differences between these regions of the northern and the middle versus the southern colonies. So that is particularly significant, of course, because I'm going to jump ahead for a second to the economic, because if the economy of the southern colonies is based upon plantation agriculture, well, then they, of course, have the significant need for labor. Now, the southern colonies were really founded for economic purposes. These were all entrepreneurs, men who were coming to the southern colonies to get rich and to establish their own businesses. So politically, Virginia was actually started as a royal colony, so there's direct control over their affairs. In Maryland, there was the proprietary colony, which meant that um, the leaders themselves had all of control over the political affairs. So a little bit of variety here in their political organization, but notably that there isn't the religious influence that there was in the northern colonies. So let's look that back now. The southern colonies are really economically focused. In turn, that drove the beginnings of the enslavement of Africans. First, this enslavement, much like the Native Americans were first enslaved in the in South America and Central America. First, there was a system known as indentured servitude, and this was a system where men from England, particularly young men who had not received inheritance from their fathers, in a system known as primogeniture in England, many of these young men would actually come to the New World, and in exchange for not paying, so their free ride essentially coming to the Americas was that they would work as an indentured servant for a fixed period of time. And of course, these were horrific working conditions, and many were treated. I mean, this is in its practice and the way that it was the living experience of these people was comparable to that of slavery, except in the massive difference that this is not based as a there's an end. These indentured servants eventually would be released. So that system, however, didn't meet the needs of the labor that was required in the colonies, and that's why the British then in turn turned to Africa. Socially, the northern colonies we talked about, your influence was based upon your position in the church, and the southern colonies, based reflecting their economic purposes. The wealthier you were, that was really that's where your social influence came from. So here's where, as I was just discussing this, in the southern colonies, this is where we see large scale plantations. Now, do know that slavery occurred in the North too. So there were many slaves who worked in the factories of the North. But numerically speaking, the vast majority of the enslaved Africans were taken to the South and to work on these plantations. These first tobacco, but tobacco was killing the land, so they needed something more profitable in some ways. So tobacco, then cotton, rice, and there are um, many other crops that were grown under enslavement. Even when the slave trade ended in 1807, the slavery continued for another 60 years essentially, because for the simple fact that in North America here, and then the British North America, enslaved Africans lived longer than those who were in Central and South America. Remember that backbreaking labor I was discussing. What that means is there was a semblance, and I'm saying semblance is it's somewhat of a semblance of a family life established in North America in the slave community. I'm saying somewhat because those families were not respected. Those bonds were broken, and slave owners didn't respect that family. But that's not to say that there wasn't a thriving culture there too. And in that way, there are many enslaved people who were born into slavery in North America in a way that didn't exist as commonly in Central and South America. So that's another notable difference. And just in general, as I already mentioned here, the number of enslaved families was far larger in North America than it was in Central or South America. So you can see some of the common destinations for where the enslaved Africans were taken. South Carolina and Charleston, Georgetown, Washington D.C. was a large slave port. So many different regions here. Lastly, this is just a cool thing. I did a study here down in this region about a group of people that I think are important to include in a discussion of slavery. The Gullah Geechee people. So in the lowland islands, I want you to think of marshes, like long grasses, um, and water. Think of the Everglades, that kind of a atmosphere. These in this region in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, these were really this marsh region had tons and tons of mosquitoes, and those mosquitoes were carrying malaria. The enslaved Africans were more resistant to malaria, more immune to malaria than the white plantation owners. Consequently, those white plantation owners often lived off of these islands, so they would live in areas that were close to but not directly on these islands. And what that meant is that there was these whole communities of people working in these rice plantations in this North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia lowland region, who basically had these independent communities, and they were very Afrocentric communities, with very unique culture that still to this day remains, and they're very it's very unique and different culturally, and it's cool to see how these communities retained their cultural unity and Afrocentrism in the face of these conditions. So it's really interesting. If you're interested, check out if you Google the Gullah Geechee ring shouters, you can hear there's in 2016 there's groups that still very much work to keep this culture alive. So just a cool thing an aside to check out. Here are your analysis questions, and I'll see you in class.